Hi, welcome to my channel. Please like and subscribe for more Unspoken History videos. Enjoy. The 70 years prior to the American Civil War are essential to understand why such a conflict occurred. The Constitution strengthened the power of the central government. It established a House of Representatives and a Senate, U.S. Constitution, 1789. Thus, Congress became bicameral and two more branches of government, executive and judiciary. The states would have representatives and would be taxed, but since both matters were apportioned to the population of each state, U.S. Constitution, there was one major issue. The southern states were slaveholders, and they wanted the slave population to be counted for their congressional representation. This would give the South a majority in Congress. Northern delegates wanted to count only free persons, including free black people in the North and South. Philbrick, 2018. This was addressed during the 1787 Constitutional Convention, and the result was the Three-Fifths Compromise. From the country's inception to Bleeding Kansas, the history of the United States up until 1859 defined the issues that would cause the Civil War: slavery and expansionism. By the late 18th century, slavery was such an important economic model for half of the country that it was protected by federal law in the Constitution. To have a functional government, a balance between pro-slavery and anti-slavery states had to be maintained. In an emerging nation that was expanding through purchase and acquisition of land, like the Louisiana Purchase, the statehood of a new territory would threaten that balance. The Missouri Compromise resulted in the formation of two states, a slave state and a free state, instead of just one for this reason. Later, popular sovereignty in the new state of Kansas created a conflict analogous to the Civil War. People with opposing views on slavery legislation fighting to govern the territory. The clash over slavery started with the Constitution. Every compromise, the Three-Fifths, the Missouri Compromise, and popular sovereignty, would delay and escalate the conflict. Given how one could repeal another, like popular sovereignty nullifying the Missouri Compromise and its territorial division of slave legality. Government bureaucracy, money, and power were not the only reasons for the Civil War. There were many slave revolts and slave uprisings. The stories of these slave revolts, uprising, and rebellions have been largely unspoken. In 1942, Herbert Aptheker found evidence of hundreds of slave revolts of 10 or more people that had been unrecognized in our historical makeup. You can read more about them in Herbert's book American Negro Slave Revolts. According to Britannica, there is documentary evidence of more than 250 uprisings, or attempted uprisings involving 10 or more slaves whose aim was personal freedom in the 2 centuries preceding the American Civil War. Wikipedia also mentions that historians have identified 250 to 311 slave uprisings in U.S. and colonial history. Here is a short summary of 18 of those uprisings and rebellions. Nat Turner's Rebellion, 1831, one of the most famous slave revolts, led by Nat Turner in Virginia. Turner and his followers killed around 60 white people before being suppressed. Denmark Vesey's Revolt, 1822, was a planned revolt in Charleston, South Carolina, led by Denmark Vesey. The plot was discovered before it could be carried out, and Vesey along with many of his followers were executed. Gabriel's Rebellion, 1800, a planned revolt in Richmond, Virginia, led by Gabriel Prosser. The plan was to capture Richmond and negotiate the end of slavery, but it was thwarted by a terrible thunderstorm that flooded the roads and washed out the bridges. Gabriel and his group was also betrayed. Gabriel and many of his followers were executed. Stono Rebellion, 1739, one of the earliest slave revolts in South Carolina. A group of Negroes killed several white people and attempted to escape to Spanish Florida. The rebellion was suppressed, and many of the participants were executed. New York Slave Revolt, 1712, a revolt in New York City where Negroes killed 9 white colonists. The revolt was quickly suppressed, and many of the participants were executed. Gloucester County Conspiracy, 1663, a planned revolt in Virginia, where indentured servants and Negro slaves conspired to overthrow the colonial government. Bacon's Rebellion, 1676, a rebellion in Virginia led by Nathaniel Bacon, which included both indentured servants and Negro slaves. New York Conspiracy of 1741, a supposed plot by Negro slaves and poor whites to burn down and take over New York City. Point Coupee Conspiracy, 1791, a planned revolt in Point Coupee Parish, Louisiana. Igbo landing slave escape and mass suicide. 1803, a group of Igbo captives who rebelled and committed mass suicide off the coast of Georgia. Chatham Manor Rebellion, 1805, a revolt at Chatham Manor in Virginia. 1811, German Coast Uprising, a large slave revolt in the territory of Orleans, now Louisiana, where enslaved Africans marched towards New Orleans. George Boxley Rebellion, 1815, a planned revolt in Virginia led by George Boxley. Black Seminole Slave Rebellion, 1835 to 1838, a series of revolts by Black Seminoles and runaway slaves in Florida. Amistad Seizure, 1839, a revolt by enslaved Africans aboard the Spanish ship Amistad. 1842, Slave Revolt in the Cherokee Nation, a revolt by enslaved Africans in the Cherokee Nation. Charleston Workhouse Slave Rebellion, 1849, a revolt by Negro slaves in Charleston, South Carolina. Second Creek Slave Conspiracy, 1860, was a planned revolt in Mississippi. American expansionism, often referred to as Manifest Destiny, was the 19th century ideology and practice of territorial growth in the United States. This belief held that Americans were destined to spread across the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. The concept was used to justify the acquisition of territories such as the Oregon Country, Texas, New Mexico, and California before the American Civil War. The expansion was driven by various factors, including economic opportunities, land ownership, and the belief in the superiority of American culture and institutions. Key events in American expansionism include the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, which doubled the size of the United States, and the westward migration of pioneers along trails like the Oregon Trail. However, this expansion also led to significant conflicts, including disputes over slavery in new territories, over American expansion, which contributed to the tensions leading up to the Civil War. According to the Center for the Study of the American Constitution, Department of History, James Madison recommended the ratio of 3/5 in counting the slaves for purposes of apportioning U.S. representatives. One of the most difficult problems faced by the Constitutional Convention was how to apportion representation of the states in Congress. The Great Compromise settled the controversy between the large and the small states by providing that the House of Representatives would be apportioned based on population, while the states would be equally represented in the Senate. Debate persisted over how to count the slave population when apportioning representatives. Southern states wanted to count the total slave population, while northern states did not want to count any slaves in making the apportionment. Another compromise determined that 3/5 of the total slave population should be counted in apportioning both representatives and direct taxes. The convention agreed to hold a national census every 10 years that would be used in determining the apportionment for the following 10 years. The 3/5 clause provoked debate during the year-long struggle over the ratification of the Constitution. Its impact was felt not only in the House of Representatives, but also in determining the number of presidential electors each state would have in the Electoral College. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 was a law that tried to address growing sectional tensions over the issue of slavery. By passing the law, which President James Monroe signed, the U.S. Congress admitted Missouri to the Union as a state that allowed slavery and Maine as a free state. It also banned slavery from the remaining Louisiana Purchase lands located north of the 36 degrees 30-foot parallel, the southern border of Missouri. The Missouri Compromise would remain in force for just over 30 years before it was repealed by the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. In 1857, the Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott decision that the compromise was unconstitutional, setting the stage for the Civil War. In 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois proposed a bill to organize the territory of Nebraska, a vast area of land that would become Kansas, Nebraska, Montana, and the Dakotas. Known as the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the controversial bill raised the possibility that slavery could be extended into territories where it had once been banned. Its passage intensified the bitter debate over slavery in the United States, which would later explode into the Civil War. Douglas hoped this idea of popular sovereignty would resolve the mounting debate over the future of slavery in the United States and enable the country to expand westward with few obstacles. But the Compromise of 1850, especially the strict new Fugitive Slave Act it contained, galvanized the abolitionist movement and fueled mounting debate over whether the institution of slavery should be allowed to expand along with the nation. Southern slaveholders and their allies in Congress opposed Douglas' initial bill to organize the Nebraska Territory. In 1821, the Missouri Compromise had outlawed slavery everywhere in the remaining Louisiana Purchase lands north of the 36° 30' parallel, and the two proposed territories lay north of this line. Douglas needed pro-slavery votes to pass his Nebraska Bill, as it was known at the time. To get them, he added an amendment that repealed the Missouri Compromise and created two new territories, Kansas and Nebraska. Settlers in each territory would vote on the issue of whether to permit slavery or not, according to the principle of popular sovereignty. In the months before the bill's passage, most of the Native American groups living on the land in question signed treaties ceding their land to the U.S. government, and all were eventually forced to move south to reservations in what is now Oklahoma. Popular sovereignty, in U.S. history, a controversial political doctrine according to which the people of federal territories should decide for themselves whether their territories would enter the Union as free or slave states. Its enemies, especially in New England, called it squatter sovereignty. It was first applied in organizing the Utah and New Mexico territories in 1850. Its most crucial application came with the passage of U.S. Senator Stephen A. Douglas's Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which repealed the prohibition of slavery north of latitude 36° 30', established in the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The violent struggle that followed for control of the Kansas Territory, see Bleeding Kansas, illustrated the failure of popular sovereignty as a possible ground for agreement between pro-slavery and anti-slavery factions in the country. It was a combination of the failure of all the acts and compromises that brought about the Civil War. The Civil War was fought between 1861 to 1865. During these conflicts, President Lincoln was trying to save this country from total collapse and destruction. The Emancipation Proclamation was written during the middle of the Civil War and did not end slavery in the nation. However, Emancipation Proclamation did capture the hearts and imagination of millions of Americans and fundamentally transformed the character of the war. After January 1, 1863, every advance of federal troops expanded the domain of freedom. Moreover, the proclamation announced the acceptance of black men into the Union Army and Navy, enabling the liberated to become liberators. By the end of the war, almost 200,000 black soldiers and sailors had fought for the Union and freedom. From the first days of the Civil War, slaves had acted to secure their own liberty. The Emancipation Proclamation confirmed their insistence that the war for the Union must become a war for freedom. It added moral force to the Union cause and strengthened the Union both militarily and politically. As a milestone along the road to slavery's final destruction, the Emancipation Proclamation has assumed a place among the great documents of human freedom. As a result of the writing of the Emancipation Proclamation and the stir that it caused in the country, civil war was on the horizon. The American Civil War, fought from 1861 to 1865, was a conflict between the northern states, the Union, and the southern states, the Confederacy, that seceded from the Union. The primary cause of the war was the long-standing disagreement over the institution of slavery and its expansion into newly acquired territories. The North, characterized by industrialization and free labor, opposed the expansion of slavery, while the South, reliant on agriculture and slave labor, sought to maintain and expand it. The election of Abraham Lincoln, a Republican who opposed the spread of slavery, triggered the secession of Southern states, starting with South Carolina. The Confederate States of America was formed, with Jefferson Davis as its president. The war began with a Confederate attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. Lincoln had used the occasion of the Union victory at Antietam to issue a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which freed all enslaved people in the rebellious states after January 1, 1863. He justified his decision as a wartime measure and did not go so far as to free the enslaved people in the border states loyal to the Union. Still, The Emancipation Proclamation deprived the Confederacy of the bulk of its labor forces and put international public opinion strongly on the Union side. Some 186,000 black Civil War soldiers would join the Union Army by the time the war ended in 1865, and 38,000 lost their lives. The Civil War resulted in significant casualties and destruction, but it ultimately led to the abolition of slavery and the preservation of the United States as a unified nation. The 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865, abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime. However, the abolition of slavery did not immediately result in equal rights for the newly freed African Americans. Several significant events and issues arose that highlighted the need for further constitutional protection of their rights. All of the wars and fighting that had taken place prior to 1865, and there were those who were not concerned with the events that had taken place to bring freedom to all Americans. Some Americans were still fighting for some form of slavery to exist in America. As a result of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, Southern states enacted black codes in 1865, which were laws designed to restrict the freedom of Negro Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force. These codes imposed severe restrictions on the rights of Negro Americans, including limitations on their ability to own property, conduct business, and move freely. Violence and discrimination. Negro Americans faced widespread violence and discrimination. White supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, emerged and used terror and violence to intimidate and oppress Negro Americans. This violence underscored the need for federal protection of their rights. All of the wars and fighting that had taken place prior to 1865, and there were those who were not concerned with the events that had taken place to bring freedom to all Americans. Some Americans were still fighting for some form of slavery to exist in America. As a result of the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, Southern states enacted black codes in 1865, which were laws designed to restrict the freedom of Negro Americans and ensure their availability as a cheap labor force. These codes imposed severe restrictions on the rights of Negro Americans, including limitations on their ability to own property, conduct business, and move freely. Violence and discrimination. Negro Americans faced widespread violence and discrimination. White supremacist groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, emerged and used terror and violence to intimidate and oppress Negro Americans. This violence underscored the need for federal protection of their rights. In response to the Black Codes and ongoing discrimination, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This act aimed to protect the civil rights of Negro Americans by granting them citizenship and equal protection under the law. However, there were concerns about the constitutionality of the act, which led to the push for a constitutional amendment to solidify these protections. These events and issues demonstrated that the abolition of slavery alone was not sufficient to guarantee the rights and freedoms of Negro Americans. The 14th Amendment, ratified on July 9, 1868, was introduced to address these concerns by providing citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, ensuring equal protection under the law, and prohibiting states from denying any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Quotes by Abraham Lincoln. Quote, "I am a firm believer in the people. If given the truth, they can be depended upon to meet any national crisis. The great point is to bring them the real facts." Quote, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution." Quote, "I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed." Quote, "America will never be destroyed from the outside. If we falter and lose our freedoms, it will be because we destroyed ourselves." Thanks for watching.